So this is Sherpa session 4, and the focus of this is sustainable finance, and in particular looking at the transition to sustainable finance. So one of the things that is framing this session is the launch of the Reporting 3.0 Sustainable Finance Blueprint. And so we've already launched it in some ways in the sense that the 2 transformation journey programs at ING and Manulife were focused on sustainable finance, and we used those to harvest and test some of what we called the golden nuggets, or ideas that were heading into our year-long process of identifying what we think the next steps are that are necessary to create sustainable finance, starting from where the field is at right now and its current level of ambition, and asking ourselves, is there a gap between the current level of ambition that's being defined on sustainable finance and what we believe is actually necessary? And in all of the other instances with the blueprints, we found that where the field is at currently, there is a gap to what's needed. So very quickly, I'm just going to point out what our 8 or 9 golden nuggets are, and then we're going to lead into brief presentations by each of our panelists. So we have Kris Douma from PRI, Manuel Adamini from the Climate Bonds Initiative, Rens van Tilburg from the Sustainable Finance Lab, and then I want to give a special thanks to Adam Garfunkel for stepping in. So Simone Detling from the UNEP Finance Initiative is launching the Principles for Responsible Banking, and she wasn't able to make it, so Adam Garfunkel, who has actually played a fundamental role in that program, has agreed to step in for Simone's session. So I will just walk you through very briefly what our 9 golden nuggets are. I'm not going to expect you to fully understand these. This is part of what we'll be working on. I'll look at 1 or 2 of them. So essentially right now the state of the art is ESG integration. We believe that that's not far enough, that just integrating environmental, social, and governance issues is not going to get us where we need. We actually need threshold-based investing. We also believe that we need to go from the existing definition of fiduciary duty into a more strategic understanding of fiduciary duty, and this is already signaled by Leo Strine, the Chief Justice of the Delaware Court system, and so we've written on that. All of these you can appeal to information that we've written on this. Of course, monocapitalism to multi-capitalism. Looking from inside out enterprise and portfolio risk to outside in systemic and existential risk. I think I have a typo in there. But essentially, that all of the risk that we're looking at is at the enterprise and portfolio level, and it's the risk that is imposed onto a company or onto an investor. And what we need to move to is actually those companies and those investment portfolios are exerting risk onto the system that then comes back in as outside-in risk. So that's what's creating risk that is rising to both the systemic level and the existential level. One way to make a change is to move from the current definition of engagement, which Generation Investment Management just recently said, yes, we are not being forceful enough in our engagement, so our partner, Preventable Surprises, calls for what's called forceful stewardship. Moving from alpha generation, so in other words, trying to create outperformance by picking specific companies that will outperform, to recognizing that it's the entire market that we have to look at, and so moving to the idea of what's called beta activism. So there's a great paper on that you can look at if you just Google beta activism. The current state of play, state of the art, is to look at scenarios. That's moved us very quickly. The TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, has done a great job of getting us as far as scenarios. That's not far enough. We need to move to what do the scenarios say and what's the actual response in terms of a plan to those scenarios. Which scenario are you going to choose? These last two were added through our transformation journey programs. So Lauren Compere from Boston Common Asset Management said that essentially lobbying is keeping the status quo in place. So we need to move from lobbying that is essentially solidifying a broken system into lobbying that is advocating for a transformed system. And finally, the last one comes to us thanks to one of our panelists, Rens van Tilburg, moving from competitive advantage to collaborative advocation. So this is clearly consistent with what we've been hearing all along, the idea that competition is on the top layer of the ocean. It's really collaboration underneath that makes things happen. So that's just a quick look, and this is what I was talking about, in terms of forceful stewardship, was the idea that was established back in 2015 by Raj Thamaratham from Preventable Surprises. And here's something from May 17th, 2019 that says Generation Investment Management says that quiet diplomacy has failed. So here we go. This is a real-time validation that what we're saying is starting to take seed. Finally, the notion of moving from the TCFD is calling for scenario analysis. Back in 2015, Preventable Surprises was calling for, this says 2017, but they established the idea back in 2015 that we actually need to move into strategizing based on those scenarios. So this is just an idea of what we're thinking about, and we'd like to hand it over to our panelists to give the idea of where they're moving to. Oh, those were supposed to be moved. So Kris, we'll call on you first to come up and give the Principles for Responsible Investing perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bill. And I like mountain hiking, so I like the metaphor today, and it made me think a couple of times today about some of these things that the metaphor. In the last session, I must admit, I thought that at some point I had not just reached the summit of the mountain, but had entered some celestial sphere. So I'll try to come back a bit back to Earth. But the other thing I think I should say, I mean, we all think in, we probably all saw the picture of the Mount Everest a couple of weeks ago when people were all moving to the summit, and it was getting rather crowded there. And that is also something that worries me from a PRI perspective and a simple investor perspective, to think, oh, there are so many initiatives all gathering around that summit of the mountain that I'm starting to get confused. So I'm Kris Douma. I work for the Principles for Responsible Investment. We're doing a lot of work on the SDGs. And I think maybe for you who don't know the organization, it's been there for around 13 years now. It has over more than 2,400 signatories, together representing $86 trillion assets under management. So it is by now the largest investor organization in the world, including the likes of Larry Fink, etc. So that's the organization that I work for. I think the most important principles are the first two. Incorporate ESG into investment decisions, and the second, incorporate ESG into your active ownership. And of course, transparency, number 3, is also very important, especially in this context. What I think, and you mentioned that briefly, Bill, and you said, to what extent is ESG solving the kinds of problems that we are facing? What I always like to do is to mention the preamble to these principles. When the principles were launched in 2006, there was a preamble to these principles, and that preamble said, we think these principles align investors with broader objectives of society. And to the people who were involved in the launch of it, I thought, okay, how would that work? How would this alignment with the broader objectives of society work? Well, there were basically 3 elements of the theory of change. So the first element of the theory of change was, if we invest in the companies that have better ESG risk management, they will have lower cost of capital, and other companies will higher cost of capital. That would give the lower cost of capital companies a competitive advantage, and that will basically eventually outcompete the non-sustainable companies. The second theory of change was, okay, once you are a shareholder and you engage with companies on their ESG risks and their ESG risk management, you will contribute to more sustainable and more better risk management in those companies. So that's the second element of the theory of change. And the third was, okay, we may allocate capital to thematic or impact investing, so specific types of investments that have a very clear sustainable contribution. So those were the three elements of the theory of change. Have they worked over the past 12 years? I don't think very well. Not enough, at least not enough. There's been very limited allocation to impact investing by institutional investors. Engagement on sustainability issues and risk management works, but it has to compete with all the other signals that companies are getting. And the cost of capital argument, well, it works, but it is a very, very slow process. It goes too slow. So the three elements of the theory of change are working, but not good and fast enough. So that is why at some point in time, 2 years ago, we developed something like a guidance on an investment strategy. So if you are an asset owner, how do you develop an investment strategy, and what do we think is currently needed to do that in a way that makes sure that you are indeed better aligned with these broader objectives of society. And that's when we introduced this idea of a third dimension. So investors look at risk and return. There's nothing against taking risk if you also get a higher return. That's how a traditional investor will argue. But what we try to do with this is say, well, whatever you do on that risk-return axis, wherever you want to position yourself, you have to be conscious of the fact that you always, at the same time, have a real-world impact. That can be either positive or it can be negative. And what we are saying as PRI is, it is possible to position yourself on the risk-return axis and at the same time have a positive real-world impact. And we think that that should be part of your strategy to incorporate that third dimension in your thinking. So that is one. Now the next thing, of course, is broader objectives of society. That was a nice thing in the preamble in 2006, but it's a very vague concept. And as Richard Howard and others have said, the Sustainable Development Goals are the broader objectives of society. And there is no question that that is now the widely accepted framework of what we want to achieve between now and 2030. So the broader objectives of society are no longer vague. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and that's what we have to do. Now the question, of course, is if I talk to an investor, he would say, yeah, that's fine, but the governments have launched these SDGs and it's their agenda, but why is it relevant for us? So what we tried to do in 2017 is, together with PricewaterhouseCoopers, we wrote a paper called the SDG Investment Case, trying to explain to institutional investors why the SDGs are relevant for them. And that's not just because of the fiduciary duty, one of your golden nuggets indeed, Bill, but also there are micro risks, there are macro risks, there are opportunities. And so these are reasons that in an investor language resonate and have a chance to get people on board to think about how can I contribute to these SDGs. So this is what we've done, and what we now see that there is a growing number of investors actually trying to do this, or at least have the intention to do it. But the question is, of course, not having the right intentions, but also how am I actually going to do it? And that's where reporting comes. And yeah, this is one other thing that you briefly mentioned, Bill, and that's the difference between ESG and SDGs. So this is where I try to explain a bit. So how is that indeed different, to move from an ESG investment perspective to an SDG perspective? And what we see in our signatory base, those over 2,000 signatories, that we see three types of investors. Some are values driven. There are not many, but some are values driven. There are some who are driven only by financial materiality. And there are some who are trying to make a positive contribution to society. And increasingly, and that's the good news, increasingly large institutional investors try to combine all three elements. So there's some values in it, do no harm. There's some, of course, there's financial materiality in it, and there is the outcomes to society element. So this is a bit the differences between the two styles. For us, and that is what it was a very clear message that we get from institutional investors. They say the TCFD, in their initial report, said that there are close to 400 reporting standards for climate, industry, regional, what have you, all sorts of reporting standards. And that was only climate. So if you look at ESG or SDGs and the broader spectrum, you have probably much more than 400 reporting standards. Well, for an institutional investor, that's a drama, because an institutional investor usually invests in 2,000, sometimes 3,000 companies. They need global standardized and comparable data. Global standardized and comparable data. And that is something that we try to work on. We have worked with a number of investor organizations to see if we can work with the reporting standards, with Richard Howitt, and the GRI that was mentioned earlier today, and SASB and a couple of others, to see if we can work towards a global standard for reporting. That is absolutely necessary. But even if we do that, if you look at the existing reporting standards, they are still in the ESG space. They are not in the SDG space. They're not in the impact space. So we have to add that element of not just, as you say, indeed, it's not just outside in, how does ESG affect my risk return, but also how does my investment affect the outside world. So to bring that into the reporting standards perspective, we have another initiative. It's called the Impact Management Project. And again, investors need global standardized and comparable data. So that's why I'm very happy that we have this group with a couple of UN organizations and a couple of corporate preparers and investor organizations around the table to develop one global standard for impact measurement. And hopefully we will have that in the near future, because only then can we reasonably ask institutional investors to allocate to these companies effectively. So we're very happy with doing that. Of course, I will not forget about the rest, but I think the important elements of this SDG impact management project is the five criteria. So what are you contributing? Who is benefiting? How much? Is this a real contribution? Or would this have happened otherwise? I mean, really have to be honest with yourself. Is this a real contribution? And of course, this last thing is about risk. So while you are creating a positive impact on the Sustainable Development Goals, of course you should not forget to do no harm. And that is the sort of the baseline. I think there has to be effective risk management to do that. So that is what we're supporting, trying to get investors to think in the 3 dimensions, accept the SDGs as the broader objectives of society, but we need global standardized and comparable data. So at the summit of the Mount Everest, very few people can reach that, and some will have to fall off the mountain or not go at all. And that is, I think, also something that worries me. As I said in the beginning, too many initiatives. There has to be innovative thinking on where it should go, and I think Reporting 3.0 is doing some of that. But we're focusing very much on bringing a couple of these standards together to have more concise, and it's not very celestial, it's very down to earth, but it's just the things that an investor needs to make an adequate investment decision. So thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. You have a seat over on there. No, you can wait. We'll pull everybody up. So over to Manuel. Great. And as I mentioned earlier, thanks to Anil Tripathi with the Climate Bonds Initiative for making the connection to you. So over to you. Thank you.
You remember better than I did. Thank you very much, Bill. Thanks for having Climate Bonds Initiative. Thanks for having me. And thanks to you guys for still being here. I mean, after all, it's warm in here. It's splendid weather outside. And this guy has even threatened you to take away at least half of your coffee. And you still stick around. So thank you for that. There we go. Well, I'm going to talk about climate bonds or green bonds in a climate emergency. Who of you guys knows what a climate bond or a green bond is? Anyone volunteering to explain? Oh, cool. I can almost go home. Thank you. For those that have not raised their hand, a green bond is just like any other green debt instrument, at least that holds for the majority of the market. You just get the green on top for free. Almost too nice to be true, isn't it? So you're investing in a security, you're giving money to a company that needs that money to make climate-relevant investments, climate-relevant projects and assets, and it tells you where the money goes and what impact you got for that. That's high over the summary. The Climate Bonds Initiative is a registered UK charity working out of London, not-for-profit, essentially with one big mission, which is to mobilize the huge 100 trillion debt markets, bond markets out there to finance climate solutions, and to do so fast and to do so at scale in light of the emergency we find ourselves at. Not-for-profit is very important if you want to mobilize a market, whether that's from scratch in young and emerging markets, or whether that's deepening and broaden markets in developed economies, we're everywhere essentially, albeit a small team. And when you bring those people together on the buyer side, so those wanting to make investments into climate-relevant projects and assets, on the sell side, those looking for money, those that need money to make those investments, then it's good if you can put yourselves there independently. We are just helping people along, so rallying them first. Once they get excited and say, yes, I want to do something, we provide data, information, research, hand-holding and guidance documents, but also we have a watchdog role where we look at market trends and comment on that very critically, but always hopefully constructively critically so. We don't do that alone. We partner with at least 100 organizations globally on the buy side and the sell side alike, and evidently fundamentally about some 14 trillion AUM. Yes, indeed, this is the day of the big numbers with Kris. That supports our work and are interested in climate as a risk and opportunity for investment. When we are talking green bonds, it's just one big name to summarize a whole lot of many things. With a climate focus or a wider environmental agenda around it, then you call it green. You guys know better than I may be. And then we call it green bonds, but essentially we're interested in any debt instrument channeling money to the right projects and assets for the 2050 sustainable world we want to use, to paraphrase Christiana Figueres. And indeed, as I said, it's a security. You're just like any other. You only get transparency about where the money goes. And clearly the money goes to those climate-relevant projects and assets. And what we're fundamentally trying to accomplish here, ladies and gentlemen, is to match three agendas. One, investors want yield. Two, we have to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions in various sectors of importance, and we have to make those investments down there in the real economy where the country in question needs it or where the company wants to deploy it. And matching those three things is the exciting thing about green bonds. This was the guiding document until today, essentially, which helped people understand where climate-relevant projects and assets are. Some are greener than others, evidently. With some, the ambition level is higher than with others. And as you know, the International Energy Agency has very forcefully warned us not to pour our money into insufficiently ambitious projects, because it will lock us into projects which may be nice, but just not good enough to get us there fast. And so we need guidance to define what is green. My organization has tried to put that out as early as 2009, and today, indeed, 2 hours before I came here, the European Commission put out a very most fundamental piece of work called the Technical Experts Technical Report about definitions around green, climate-relevant, 2050 zero-carbon-aligned investments in the real economy in various sectors of the economy. Have a look. This is the market, how it has been growing. We've truncated the first couple of years when it started very, very slowly, with the European Investment Bank and the World Bank essentially inventing the product and the market in 2007-8, and then taking off at a certain point in time. What you do see is there's more diversity coming in terms of sectors where the issuance is coming from, i.e. those companies and other entities looking for money and wanting to deploy projects and assets. That's grown, but still isn't where it should be, nor in diversity, neither in impact. But it's looking reasonably good. We almost hit the 200 billion last year. We're very confident we may hit it this year in terms of new issuance. We're talking about our almost $600 billion outstanding, which still is a drop in the ocean in the grand scheme of things, but a good start. We have good diversity in terms of countries where issuance is coming from, in terms of new issues and repeat issuers coming to market, and both government-related entities and corporates. That's the mix we need. However, it's, as I said, just a start. And everyone is extraordinarily excited about those 580 or almost $600 billion outstanding. But there's so much more around it. There's at least another trillion of highly climate-relevant projects and assets out there, but nobody calls them such. And that makes it a big problem for investors. I worked for an asset management company earlier, and what you need is data. Indeed, Kris has talked about data and insight, like, where are those investments? How can I find them? How can I put my money into them? And these extra trillion there, we define once a year. It's not labeled as climate relevant. Nobody has said it, but it is. So it's important discovery work. And together, this might help us bridge this 1 trillion that Christiana Figueres, the former head of the UNFCCC, has given us as homework for this part of the market. But still, there's so much more to be done. We're talking about an almost 100 trillion bond market that we need to green at this scale and very, very fast indeed, ladies and gentlemen, to get to close those funding gaps that the UN Secretary General has recently upped from those 3 to 5 to 5 to 7 trillion a year, isn't it, down to 2030, and it's being upped every month, more or less. If you want to know more, this was just a very, very quick overview. Please go to our website, don't hesitate, you'll be killed with reports of regional or thematic nature, and otherwise, if you can't sort it, just give me a call. Thank you very much.
Great, and I'm going to actually do something that I haven't done thus far, is actually click ahead to the slide that's been prepared to introduce the next speaker. So Rens van Tilburg from the Dutch Sustainable Finance Lab. I invite you up. We got a taste when you visited the Transformation Journey program, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Rens.
And thank you all for being here. I learned at the previous session that it's more important to provide questions than answers. So in that sense, I'm on the safe side, because I'm mainly going to throw a big challenge to you. And hopefully in the discussion, you might also help me to get answers, because this is sort of like the big question that I'm thinking about. So I'm Rens van Tilburg. I'm the director of the Sustainable Finance Lab, which is a think tank in the Netherlands with members from different universities. So Dirk Schoenmaker from Erasmus University is one of those. And we have started about 10 years ago, started from Utrecht University, so where we also have a small but very high quality secretariat working with 5 great people. I'm very enthusiastic about the golden nuggets. I'm in particular also the one that I was able to add. I'm very proud of that. But I think they're very important. And I think they're a big challenge, and we need to do that in a hurry, is to see how we can convince the financial sector to actually live up to the challenge that they pose. And a little bit of an explanation maybe how we have worked at Sustainable Finance Lab. Because when we started in 2010, our idea mainly was, so this was just after the Lehman crisis and before the Euro crisis started. So at that time, the idea in the financial sector was a little bit like, well, was this the big crisis of our generation? It was not that bad, was it? Actually the members of Sustainable Finance Lab, they thought, well, they probably don't know half what's coming. And we were very much thinking about the sustainability transition that really still needed to get its impact in the financial sector, and how that is going to change things, and how badly prepared actually most financial institutions are for that. So we wanted to work on these ecological issues, and then the Eurozone crisis erupted. Banks started to fall again and needed to be saved by taxpayers' money. So we were the first couple of years only working on financial stability issues. So the people that we were talking to, they were from the risk departments from the financial sector. They were the board members, because we were saying we needed to have more capital in banks, and that's very much a board issue. And well, after a couple of years, 3 years, we were sort of like finished with that discussion, and then we said, okay, now we're going to focus more on the ecological side. And then we started to do our first research into climate risk. And we decided not to engage too much with the people working in the sustainability departments of financial institutions, but rather to keep talking to the people that we've been talking to all along, the board members and the people from the risk department. So we were asking, how is, in this case, climate risk relevant for a financial institution? And actually, the first reports that we made, so this was thinking along the lines of a carbon bubble scenario. We were almost laughed away by those same people. And they were saying, like, Rens, we know you, you're a nice guy. And as you, we also care very much about sustainability. But I do that at home. So at home, I put a LED lighting in, and that's my contribution to sustainability. But here you're talking to me as a board member of a big financial institution. And of course, I cannot do anything with these this climate challenge. So I'm not a politician. I'm not an NGO. So it's not up to me to do anything about this. And I must say that it's remarkable, and that is something that I really feel as a very positive thing, how quickly things have changed. Because these were the kind of things that I was hearing only 4 years ago. And look where we are now, especially in the Netherlands, I think, where we have a supervisor who's totally convinced that this is a major issue. Actually, it's one of the 3 priorities for the next 5 years. And in all the big financial institutions in the Netherlands, they have quite large dedicated teams looking into these issues, looking into climate risk. So that's something to be positive about, because 4 years ago I would not have even dared to wish that things would have moved so quickly. However, that brings into focus a new kind of problem as well, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. Is this picture. This picture comes from a report, one of the first reports that the Dutch Central Bank made on climate risk. And it shows where in the world climate risk will have its biggest impact. And as you see, that's in Africa, that's in Southeast Asia. And this analysis was being done by the Dutch Central Bank because they have as their primary objective the stability of the Dutch financial sector. So they are interested, how big a risk is this climate risk for our financial institutions? And, well, this is the other picture to look at, and that's where do Dutch financial institutions have their money invested. And what you see is that is a very comforting thought for the Dutch financial sector, for the Dutch regulator, is that we have actually put most of our money, so I will go back, most of our money, it's in the US, it's in Europe, and that's all pretty green. So from that sense, a very comforting thought. And what we are seeing now happening in the financial sector, now that they are increasingly aware of these climate risks, is that they understand this. And we already have the first, even so-called responsible investment products, which say we've done the math on climate change. And we have here a very responsible product, and it is very responsible because it does not invest in Southeast Asia, where we have all these troubles lurking. And I think that is a very, very dangerous development. Because, think again, where do most of the people live? And where's the largest growth of population? That's in the same regions, Southeast Asia and Africa. And actually, at the moment, there is a lot of wealth created there as well. So that people are moving to the cities. And it's there that in the coming 10 years, the large investments are being made in infrastructure for energy, for transport, for living, which actually decide whether or not we globally will be able to stay within the 2-degree limit. And there's a lot of reports around which show that it is easy to finance that in a sustainable way. Because it's the famous clean trillion. That's the extra cost that we need. We need to make a cost of 4 trillion a year anyway for these new infrastructures. If we do it in a sustainable way, it will be 5 trillion. So what will happen if we, in the West, where we have most of the money, and we are not bringing it to the places where it's needed, where the people are building those infrastructures anyway. So what kind of infrastructure will they actually be building? That will not be the sustainable kind of infrastructure. So in that sense, the kind of like responsible investment products which make sure the money is not flowing there are probably the quickest way to make sure that we will get a systemic dramatic effect and we will not be able to stop climate change. So in that sense, I think a lot of the golden nuggets, if you would apply them, they would give a solution to this problem. But my main question is, how are we going to bring the financial institutions who do look at their micro, with a micro view to their own balance sheet, to take this into account? Thank you.
Thank you, and that's our question as well. Okay, thank you. And so, last contribution from Adam Garfunkel and from Junxion, but representing the Principles for Responsible Banking. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Working? Working? It's working.
There you go.
Hi. Yeah, I'm not Simone Detling. I'm sorry. Simone's awesome and has been living and breathing this initiative for, I don't know, a couple of years. Some of you have been working with her and know how hard this job is. So let's hope she gets well soon. So really, I'm just going to present to you the principles for responsible banking, what they are, why they've come about, and what they involve, and then perhaps in a panel discussion we can get into a little bit of the kind of differences between them and some other initiatives out there, and I'll do my best. As you probably know from yesterday, I work at the junction of strategic communications and sustainability thinking, so I'm not, native full-time to the sustainable finance world. So go easy on me. When I send money back to Junxion in Canada, I don't use a bank, I use TransferWise. When I speak to other people in the UK B Corp community, they're all just desperate for Triodos to get its commercial banking plans worked out so that we can all shift away from HSBC and other mainstream banks. So there is a kind of crisis of legitimacy for mainstream banks. And in order to regain trust, clearly banks have to declare a purpose. They have to show that they're taking responsibility and that they provide value to their communities where they operate and to the world at large. And that's not only kind of a thing they have to do, but it's a thing that's going to build success for the future. Because a bank that understands where we're heading is much better placed to take advantage of the opportunities that are going to come as we move through this climate crisis and this collapse that we've been hearing about today. It's vital that banks understand how they will continue to create value in that context. So I'm going to just run through the principles. There are 6 of them. Maybe we missed one. No? Okay. There are 6 principles. Why were they developed? They were developed because they're needed. Short answer. This is the fundamental idea. Banks have to align their business practices and their strategy and their portfolio at every level with what the world needs, as expressed through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. So those of you who will have heard me talk about this briefly yesterday, this is big stuff. This is explicitly normative. This is saying this is the way the world needs to be, and banks, you have to build that in as you develop your strategy. How are they going to do that? They're going to do that by focusing where they have the most significant impact. And this is a change. This is, to one of those nuggets, Bill, this is about inside-out thinking. So not only thinking what impact will developments in the world have on us, but what impact does our portfolio have on the world? And that's a crucial shift that we need to see from the banking community. We've heard examples of how ING are on that journey, and in case you don't know, ING are one of the founding banks of the principles, along with Triodos, who I mentioned earlier. And it's got to look at everything that the bank does, but the significant impacts. A kind of materiality process, I guess, is embedded in this principle. But of course, where does a bank have impact? It has impact through its clients and customers, through the work that it does with them. So the purpose of this principle is to make it very clear that we're not talking about no more plastic cups in head office, right? I hate that stuff. It's about working with clients and customers to encourage them to adopt sustainable practices, to make them think harder about what steps they're taking, how they are seeking to use those investment dollars. And so that banks are effectively driving us towards the world that we need to live in through their lending and investment practices. But of course, they can't do it alone. They don't know everything. So principle 4 is about working with and engaging with relevant stakeholders, rights holders, of course, in reporting 3.0 language, but to work proactively and responsibly, so consult with experts in various fields. We heard earlier that why didn't you consult earlier, you were told? I mean, that's exactly the kind of premise of this thinking. To engage actively with policymakers and to partner with third parties, tech companies, in order to develop the solutions that will help us deliver on what we need and the world we want to make. And here, I guess, the principles for responsible banking are seeking to learn from previous principles, embedding through effective governance and a culture of responsible banking, embedding these practices in the very day-to-day of that bank, and setting targets, crucially, that are based around the most important things that that bank does, the most important areas, the most significant areas where that bank has an impact. So public targets, which other initiatives, PRI, I guess, didn't really have, hasn't had that same kind of focus on what I guess I think of as a fairly mainstream idea of kind of responsible sustainability management. And then to report on progress. To periodically review both the efforts of the individual banks, how are we doing on our plan, but also for all the banks that are signatories to work together on a collective goal and to report collectively on how the signatories are doing in shifting us to a more sustainable world. And I think interestingly in here, the accountability mechanism has some real teeth. The idea is that if you don't report on your most significant impacts or on those areas or sufficiently well on them, then you can be delisted as a signatory. You can be chucked out of the principles. So I think, again, it's got potentially got some real teeth. The idea is that any bank can get involved. You start from where you are. It's a ramp up. So there are kind of graded accountability mechanisms, whether you're a mature bank or a less mature bank. We don't need to get into that detail. It's kind of still being worked out. But it's potentially a real game changer for the world's banks, and why I was super excited to get involved writing the communication strategy for it in the second half of last year. So part of that process that we did then was to recognize that the principles are in a funny place right now. So just to give you a little bit of the detail on where we're at in their journey, they were being developed by 28 founding banks through last year. They were launched at the end of November in Paris, but they're not open for signature until they are officially launched at the UN General Assembly in New York in the second half of September later this year. So what we did was we came up with the idea of endorsing. So there are founding banks and there are now endorsing banks. ABN AMRO is an endorsing bank, for example. ING is one of the founders. And we also came up with the idea that non-bank institutions could be endorsers. So the European Banking Federation, for example, is an endorser. And I think in that way, the idea is to kind of build a coalition of support that kind of socializes the idea of these principles, and so that when they are officially opened for signature in September, they have a certain momentum behind them, and that they deliver on their promise. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to borrow this momentarily, but if you could have a seat, all the panelists have a seat, and I'm just going to borrow the microphone and give it back to you in terms of asking Rado from ING as one of the founding banks. Oh, you've got one. Great. If you could hand that to Rado. And just ask for a few words about your experience with ING as being a founding member of PRB and the value that you see.
Well, I think it all comes back to what we were talking about yesterday about operating in context, understanding what are our real impacts and opportunities to create impact on the positive and on the negative side. I think what inspired the emergence of this initiative was that there was, of course, PRI for the investment community, but there wasn't really such an initiative on the banking side for lenders, for pure lenders like ING. So Unipify, I think, was inspired greatly by the PRI initiative, and so you'll probably notice that the principles are very similar to the PRI. So we are still looking for engagement with clients and customers. We're looking at goals. We'll be engaging client and customers on that. We've added a level of accountability and transparency to the principles, and we're looking to engage more actors and more stakeholders in this process. So in terms of impact, we're still working out the accountability framework. So as Adam mentioned, the principles haven't been launched yet. That's in September. So we're currently creating a self-assessment process, and we'll be asking signatories to obtain third-party assurance to bring that sense of transparency and accountability. And as Adam mentioned, there will be an option to delist a member or make a member inactive to show that they're not making progress over time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rado. Okay, so in terms of going into the dialogue section, essentially each of you has shared both where your initiative or the work that you're looking at is and where you're heading. And I particularly liked, Kris, how you pointed out how PRI made the step to add that third dimension. So I wonder if just each of you could speak briefly about where you see the limitations of your own initiative and ways that those limitations can be overcome. So in a sense, are there any of these golden nuggets where you're not active right now and it's an opportunity to step into activism around that, or even instances where you're in early stages? So maybe just start and go in the order that we've gone. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Try to not have people go crazy.
Oops.
Okay, there we go.
Oh, back to the nuggets, you mean? Yeah.
Great.
Well, as I said, there's when we discussed with some of our members, we call them signatories, about, okay, what are the things that we should do to actually help you all to start allocating capital to the SDGs. And the reporting issue is one of them. So, as I said, I mean, there are some investors who want very customized, detailed information of a company, but those are the investors with relatively small portfolios. Most institutional investors, and if you like it or not, but most institutional investors have widespread portfolios with 2,000, 3,000 companies. So they need global standardized comparable data. So that's one. The other things are, the SDGs are a great, and I sometimes have the chance to speak with the people at the United Nations, that you don't know how much gold you have in your hand. It's not a gold nugget, it's bigger than a nugget. But you say that the private sector has to contribute to the SDGs, but you haven't really helped the private sector to actually do it. So there's a couple of things. You haven't given us any guidance on what qualifies as SDG relevant business activity or investment. There is something called a voluntary national review. So countries produce a voluntary national review on how far they are on the SDGs. But that's not a roadmap of what they intend to do. So what I would like to see is for countries to presenting a roadmap. This is what we're going to do on the SDGs, and this is where we invite corporates and investors to contribute. So that is currently not taking place. We have incentivized the meeting to do that in Brazil, with the Brazilian government and with Brazilian public authorities, investors, local investors and foreign investors, corporates, local and foreign, to sit around the table and to ask the Brazilian government, this is the SDG agenda, and you have signed to that. What do you want us to do? So this is just one other example of, I think there are still some major gaps and opportunities to fill if people all pull up their sleeves and start working.
Okay, great. That's an example of what we call advocation with Reporting 3.0, is asking other players in the system to do their part as well. Over to you, Manuel.
Limitations, how to overcome them. Well, I think if you look at green bonds as simply being green bonds, then it's always going to remain very limited in size. I mean, even if the outstanding doubles from 600 billion to 1.2 trillion, so you remember the huge chunk there of 90 trillion bonds markets, it will always remain a drop in the ocean. even if you take in other stuff and you bring in many financial instruments, you bring in the corporate players, then still it would remain small. Why I'm so very excited, and I've indeed devoted the last 5 years of my working life to that, is that using green bonds essentially as a conduit to talk climate finance and to talk bigger changes, largely taking your nugget there on transformation planning and really changing how to shift capital expenditure at corporates or budgets when you're talking governments to the low carbon economy we need. So if you use green bonds as an excuse to talk a bigger agenda, if you use it as a talking stick, if you so will, to go to a company and say, okay, you know, a green bond may be a fantastic means for your reputation, for your marketing, whatever, but essentially it's just a signal for you to display to the wider community, including investors evidently, how you will align yourselves with a low carbon economy and how this green bond helps you attract the money you need to change your capital expenditure patterns toward climate-friendly projects and assets, outphasing others. Then I think it becomes extraordinarily exciting. And the same holds for governments. Then you don't talk capex, you talk budgets and spending or subsidies, and you don't talk balance sheet, but you talk NDCs, for example. But the analogy is definitely there. And I think then it really holds tremendous potential.
Okay, great. So using it as a signal leading into a deeper strategic engagement.
As an excuse,
as a wedge.
But a nice one.
Yep, great. Rens.
Yeah, well, I mean, my whole presentation essentially was about a problem.
Right.
And I mean, in the end, it's a big coordination problem. Because even through a purely financial prism, for most financial institutions, the better outcome will be anyway to not have climate change, to keep it within the 2-degree boundaries. But the way things are playing out now, there is a very reasonable chance that we're not going to make that. So everybody has an interest, even a financial interest, to get to the good outcome. But how are we going to get that coordination problem solved? So that's why I put this competitive advantage to collaborative action there. I think that's very important. Just like the not looking at your enterprise risk, but the systemic risk. I think that will really help. And in a sense, I do see a lot of good developments. I think a lot of them are here on the couch, where financial institutions are working together. Something that I'm in particular enthusiastic about is the Climate Action 100 Plus program. So bringing together a lot of financial institutions on a real agenda, a really meaningful agenda, and really using the power that they have. But it's still using the power towards those companies. And they do not yet take these kind of issues on their agenda, but I think that could be one way out to broaden their agenda. And I must say another party I'm very much looking towards, because we are talking essentially about the coordination problem. So it will be very hard for individual market players to solve this. When we look at governments, probably they're not the first one to think of as well. But where I see a lot of interesting things happening is around central banks as regulators. And since I think it's less than a year now, we have a network for greening the financial system where, well, I think most of the important central banks have come together. Not yet the US, but let's wait for the time. And I think also if it's put there on the table, I think those are people who are really used to thinking on a systemic level. That may be a very important force for this.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I've heard that's recently been getting even more attention, the central banking role. So thank you for that. And Adam, fine.
Yeah, I mean, some echoes. I approached the Bank of England and said, why don't you endorse the principles? And they said, yeah, we've been slapped down for kind of straying outside our remit, so we don't think we're going to do that. But they're thinking of making a reference to them at the UN General Assembly, which is kind of cool. Listen, the principles are barely, they're being produced now. They're not open for signature yet. So we're in a kind of different position. Right. But there's definitely a risk that they will kind of limp away and not fulfill their promise. And I guess, that does give me pause for thought. it's not felt to me to be a strategic duty to kind of, and it's a potential to use it as an umbrella for everything. It's supposed to be the strategic, the transaction, the portfolio, everything that you're doing should be kind of, it could be embodied by those principles. So that's, it's unfair to say no one's kind of vocalized that yet because they're not even open for signature. But I think that's the kind of stuff that we need to see, people using it to send a signal about their intentionality in this area. The other key thing that is a challenge is targets. Targets have to be met. Right? Where you have to feel like you're on track. Like if you're going to go out there and be bold, as the principles have been, and said, we want to see everyone that's a signatory meeting or exceeding the targets in the SDGs, then you're going to want to see that you're on track.
Right.
So you can't wait till 2023, 24 before you start producing some report about how well you're doing. There's going to have to be some real pace. And that's super difficult when you've got dozens of banks that need coordinating in order to demonstrate that
Right,
progress.
so principles for responsible banking are in some ways benefiting from the past experience of UN Global Compact that we had here earlier, represented by Laura, and Principles for Responsible Investment, which is not officially a UN agency, but it's essentially so. But introducing those teeth later in the development, which I think when those initiatives were launched, that was sort of necessary. And so in some ways, this is representing the maturation of the field, is that you can launch a similar organization with the teeth in place to begin with, and then also have it be normative-based or threshold-based from the get-go, which is part of what we were really appreciative about.
Right, but then, you got to meet your damn targets.
That's right. Great. Well, we, in order to honor the need for people to take care of some coffee and other biological necessities, we're going to call it there and stay on track. So what time do people need to be back here for the start of the next? Quarter 2. Okay, so quarter 2 back here, and we will have 2 final sessions. So thank you to the panel.